I'll start us off here today, I guess. I'm going to talk about some work with a couple of co-authors, so I put them up here along with me. And this is a sort of a big change from the lunch talk in terms of the topic. Although at the end of the day, I think we're talking about big money as well and big issues. There's a lot of interest in trying to understand differences in educational attainment. In more developed countries, it's post-secondary educational attainment. How attendance patterns and university or college completion patterns vary by family income, and the role of family resources in determining who goes to college or university, where they go, how they end up doing afterwards. We know these issues are important for both equity issues and efficiency. Non-economists who could care less about efficiency care a lot about this issue in terms of intergenerational mobility, equity across individuals, equal access type of arguments. And then economists who could care, some economists who could care less about equity care about this issue in many ways due to concerns that high ability, smart, potentially very productive individuals may not be going, are they able to access the education they need or that would be optimal or efficient? And there's concerns about borrowing constraints, whether borrowing constraints are the problem or whether it's other barriers, sort of information barriers, what it is that's actually determining these allocations and who goes to university or college. It's been at the center of the literature on education and human capital for maybe 20 to 30 years. People have been thinking about this and trying to break some ground on it, and we're not the first nor the last to make a contribution in this area. To put it in a broader perspective, we just sort of the amounts of money just bounced around in the lunch talk are enormous. It may make it sound like we're talking small potatoes here, but if you look at how much the U.S. spent just in terms of direct educational costs for higher education between government and private individuals and institutions, you're talking on order of $500 billion in recent years. And if you add on to that foregone earnings and the costs associated with that, you're talking over $1 trillion a year just in terms of higher educational investment. So this is big money. And every year we're putting it in, you want to think about it as investing in individuals. There's a real question of what's the right way to finance that. What's the optimal way to finance that? What are our objectives? And what do we want to achieve? And how do we do it? Countries have taken very different tracks on this. There's most countries in Europe, or if you go to Latin America, essentially provide post-secondary education effectively at no direct cost to the individuals. Of course, there's still the foregone earnings, and that's a sizable cost as well. But they bear the burden of this $500 trillion in the U.S. Most governments around the world actually bear that themselves. Canada and the U.S. and the U.K. and a number of other countries, more developed countries in general, tend to provide some subsidies for education, but they also charge tuition, non-negligible tuition. But what you see in Canada and the U.S. and most of these countries that do have tuition that's non-negligible, there's a sort of a whole structure of need-based financial aid targeted to lower income youth from lower income families, trying to sort of equalize access. And the question that we're really interested in this paper and trying to think about this, usually, so this whole conference is about dichotomies. The micro-empirical approach to these kinds of issues is typically thinking about a particular policy. If we change this, sort of add some new student loan program, or we add some new little Washington, D.C. tries some new grant program. What is the impact on educational attainment there? And it tends to look at things in a very narrow isolation, one small piece of what's really quite a big pie. And I think this paper tries to sort of step back and take a sort of a view from the sort of from way up high and say, how does the whole structure itself look? What does the whole structure of financial aid look, and how might that impact who's going to university and college? And what role is that playing in determining this relationship between family income and post-secondary attendance? So we're going to sort of look specifically at Canada and the United States. So there's a lot of evidence, to the extent that you can get agreement among empirical economists or any economist. I think we've got quite a consensus that changes in tuition matter for who attends, or affect post-secondary attendance. As one would expect, if you increase the price, you lower sort of demand. The consensus estimates really, sort of from a wide range of approaches, suggest about $1,000 in tuition, increase in tuition would lower attendance rates by about 3 to 5 percentage points. And you see that most of those studies are in the U.S., but Nicole Fortin has a paper comparing Canada and the U.S. and finds very similar effects in both countries. So when you think about that, and I'm going to show you some numbers about how big financial aid is at the low end of the income distribution, this suggests sort of an enormous impact of the way of need-based financial aid on the whole structure of who attends post-secondary attendance. So to the extent that you believe these numbers, and I think I do, that suggests sort of a very important role for the financial aid policy. The question that we're going to try to ask in this paper, in some sense, is does the structure of financial aid policy in Canada and the U.S. help us understand the patterns we see in terms of who attends university? So I'm going to use some data from Canada and the U.S. In the interest of time, I'm not really going to go through this, but we're going to look at essentially cohorts born that were attending university in the early 2000s. You should think about that. It's roughly the cohort we're looking at. And we're going to look at their post-secondary. I'm going to start off by looking at how post-secondary attendance is related to family income, talk very briefly about the structure of financial aid, and then try to tie it together briefly. So if you look at who attends university, the nice thing about these two surveys that we have that are very comparable in cohorts in the US and Canada are that we have very good measures of sort of math and reading achievement during adolescence. Both surveys, they're different measures, but they both have sort of reasonably good measures, and we have good measures of family income in these surveys when these kids are in their teenage years as well. So what we can look at is, we're mostly going to be interested in is how important is family income when we look at individuals that may have the same ability or achievement levels or the same family background. How important is family income? We can sort of a next step, and a step we're working on elsewhere in other work, is thinking about, well, what determines these ability distributions in the first place, or these achievement distributions among adolescents. I should be careful. It says ability. I want you to think of math and reading achievement. It's not something, I don't want you to think of it as an innate ability. What we see in Canada is within an ability group, and each of these sort of these groups are within an ability group, how important is family income? And you see family, first thing you see is, how good you are at math and reading is really important for whether you attend university or not. And you see within Canada, family income is really not that important, except maybe at the very low end of the ability distribution. The very rich kids seem to be a lot more likely to go. But there's not much difference once you condition on achievement. If you don't condition on achievement, there are these large gaps, and it's largely driven between the strong correlation between achievement and family income. But you turn to the U.S. and you get a completely different picture that emerges. And you see within any ability is still really important, or achievement levels, but within any ability category, you see pretty big differences by family income. We can go a step further and condition on sort of a variety of other characteristics, like whether you're an immigrant or not, family structure, parental education, and again say how important is income once we sort of look at someone with sort of the same background characteristics. And if you do that on average across all these ability groups, you get something like this. The red line is sort of the importance of family income in Canada, and what I basically want you to get out of that is the effects of family income in the United States are about twice as strong as they are in Canada when you hold constant family background and adolescent achievement levels. If you don't hold anything constant, you still get that relationship. They're just strong. It's stronger in both countries. So for whatever reason, family income is a lot more important in the US for who attends university than it is in Canada. So the question we're interested in is, you know, what role is the structure of financial aid playing in determining this? Can we, so sort of our knee-jerk reaction was, well, everybody knows tuition's lower in Canada, so maybe that's not that surprising. Well, it turns out that's not really the right way to think about it. What we do is to think of two measures. You could focus on net tuition. We want to think about the price that people actually pay. And we want to ask, what price do people pay, and how does that depend on family income? So we could think of net tuition, where we subtract off grants or scholarships, any tax credits, anything you don't have to pay back. And that's sort of a measure of what the actual price individuals pay for school. And then we can also subtract off loans if we want to get some measure of costs that they have to pay out of pocket. That has to either come from the parent's income, has to come from parental savings, or come from students working. So that's sort of more a measure of liquidity. And the question is, how do these look in Canada and the US? And what we've shown here is net tuition as a function of family income, parental income, in low and high tuition states in the US. That's the black lines. The red line is Quebec, the blue line is Ontario, and the green line is British Columbia, 3 provinces. And so the thing that sort of hits you in the face is, if you're a low-income family, a kid from a low-income family, you're getting paid $3,000 a year to go to college or university in the United States. In Canada, you're paying money. Surprisingly, the low tuition states in the US look a whole lot like Quebec. And that just, despite very different initial tuition levels. If you're a middle-income kid, actually you are better off in Canada. You're paying lower tuition. One of the most surprising things we noted here is that Canada is incredibly generous is equally generous across the whole bottom half of the distribution, whereas the US targets aid considerably to the very bottom of the distribution. If you look at out-of-pocket costs, you see something very similar. So the question is, an obvious question is sort of, what does this imply? How is this distorting family income attendance relationships? What role does this play? So we can ask, if we go back and we say for every $1,000 you get off in terms of a tuition break, the estimates suggest you'll see 3 to 5% more students going to university. You know, the fact that these lines for the US, for the bottom income students, pay about $5,000 to $6,000 less suggests a dramatic effect. We might expect a dramatic implications of these tuition schedules on who attends college. So essentially, you can imagine wiping out all this need-based aid and making everybody save the same price as the very high-income individuals. The question is, what would that do? Essentially, it would double, using these estimates from the literature would suggest that it would double the post-secondary income, family income post-secondary attendance gaps in both the US and Canada. And it would make it even more dramatic comparing Canada and the US. So these solid lines represent Canada and the US as they are, and these dotted lines represent how those relationships would change if we were to remove need-based aid. And you see sort of a dramatic effect in the United States. So if we were to sort of equalize aid policies across Canada and the United States, the differences in income attendance relationships would be even more dramatic than they currently are. Let me skip over this. So we could also do another thought experiment that says, what happens if how much aid would we have to provide if we wanted to eliminate these income attendance relationships conditional on family background? And it suggests you'd have to spend about another 60 to 100% more in Canada and the US on financial aid than we currently do. Let me not go over that. So the main sort of conclusion from this is post-secondary attendance and family income are much more strongly related in the US than in Canada. And at the high end of the income distribution, attendance rates are very similar in the US and Canada. But at the low end of the income distribution, kids in the US are much less likely to attend university or college than they are in Canada. So it's something about the low end that's quite different. And what's kind of most interesting about it is It's not easy to explain by looking at financial aid policies and tuition and prices, the traditional things economists have focused on. Indeed, if you sort of condition on the fact that these countries have different financial aid policies and you were to equalize them, you'd have an even bigger puzzle to explain. It's even more surprising that U.S. kids are so low-income kids in the U.S. are so much less likely to attend than in Canada. We might expect the opposite, just based on financial aid policies. So I mean, what I think is interesting, what I think is, ties in tightly with sort of the goals of this conference is, it suggests there's really something very strong in the United States that's discouraging attendance among low-income youth. And it's more than just credit constraints. The U.S. is more generous than Canada, yet we see this big discrepancy in the U.S. There's no, I didn't really go over this, but there's no evidence that it's peer effects or geographic segregation. It's not likely to be different labor markets given some of the things we look at. A real interesting question, part of it is due to high school completion rates in the U.S. are strongly related to family income. Not as much as post-secondary attendance, but they also are. And that explains about half the difference in post-secondary attendance between Canada and the U.S. But it raises question that, in some sense, economists are only starting to think about, but most other disciplines in social science have spent a lot more time on. And this is where I think economists have a lot to learn by interacting more broadly, and that is, starts raising questions about, what sort of information do these kids, low-income kids in the U.S. have? Are they misinformed about the cost or the returns to higher education? Are there differences in tastes or preferences? These are questions economists are very reluctant to go down that path, but is there sort of social stigma that or social interactions? Are those effects important? And is that part of what's going on? And that's sort of kind of some of the path future, but we don't have those answers yet.
Okay, hopefully this will work. I just spent a week in Rome, and on the plane somehow started to lose my voice from a very bad sore throat. So what I've done is given you both an article by Alberto Quadricorcio on a conference at my research center in Cambridge that we held in mid-September, and a translation of that in English, which should give you a narrative that explains some of the approach that I'm going to talk about here. Also, when I can speak, I tend to extemporize quite a lot. So although this PowerPoint presentation is animated, I'm not going to be able to extemporize an explanation to the same degree. So you may have to rely to a certain extent on the slides. So if there's anybody who'd like to move forward in order to be able to see the slides, you're welcome to do that. Because despite taking all the cold medicine I could find, I doubt very seriously that I'm going to be able to sustain 20 minutes of meaningful discourse on these slides. First of all, with respect to structural analysis, many of you know that there are French and Italian traditions. Those are well established. I think you'll see that this does bear some relationship to those traditions, but also aims to go beyond what is normally meant by structural analysis in the 20th century. We're we're interested in both synchronic and diachronic approaches, and particularly in retaining a place for contingency in the structural analysis that, that we're doing. And I think, actually, coughing is proving contagious. So my co-speakers are coughing as well. Okay. First of all, in terms of the contribution to the debate, I'm going to try to describe the structural approach, explaining why it helps overcome macro-micro dualism and its focus on empirical regularities. I want to open the black box and consider intermediate or meso levels of aggregation and to identify the mechanisms, to ask some new questions and to see some new phenomena, and also hopefully to convince you that this is possible, it will contribute to understanding the Eurozone crisis. Okay. In terms of structural approaches, the internal structure of a system is necessary to understand many socioeconomic phenomena. We've known that since Herbert Simon, but too often in agent-based modeling today in economics, it's impossible to talk about this intermediate level or the internal structure. To demonstrate, you have, in terms of macro-micro approaches and structural approaches, this illustrates the difference. In structural approaches, we talk about sectors, we talk about the interdependencies, we talk about proportions, whereas in macro-micro approaches, you have only the agents. You have no way of talking about relative positions or about hierarchy. And what I want to suggest is the structural approach is a response to the sort of call that Robert Johnson made yesterday about how we can have economics talk about power, because ultimately what this does is to let us think about power. In terms of intermediate levels of aggregation, they're necessary in order to identify causal mechanisms, connecting microprocesses with overall outcomes. To illustrate this with the kind of toy example, flexible wages are supposed to lead to higher employment in conventional micro-macro approaches. In structural approaches, flexible wages in economies with higher proportion of backward sectors actually have a lower growth potential. In economies with lower proportion of backward sectors, a higher growth potential. Again, just a toy example, but it illustrates what how we're trying to think about this. In terms of empirical regularities versus mechanisms, and macro-micro approaches, you have empirical regularities that higher growth is associated with flexible wages on average. In structural approaches, we look at the mechanism, the structural dynamics, the workings of different structures with a higher or lower proportion of backward sectors can lead to different or even opposite outcomes. And in structural analysis, a given structure is compatible with many workings of a mechanism. Hence, structural analysis leaves open a field of virtual outcomes that were grounded in possible but did not actually happen, which permits us to study possibility instead of probability and lets us tease apart the difference between thinking about fundamental uncertainty versus trying to quantify everything in terms of risk, probabilities attached, and risks. Okay, so as a consequence, this approach subsumes empirical regularities and what actually happens, which is to say the singularities. Again, this is hard going for me in terms of trying to project my voice at all. I don't know if you can actually hear me. Okay. Okay. Yeah. In terms of the Eurozone crisis, how does structural analysis help? What new questions and insights does it provide? First, in terms of historical perspectives, the diachronic approach, we're talking about relative persistence, path dependencies that limit possibilities, but do not determine a unique outcome. And I think in terms of examples of path dependencies, we can certainly point to a number of them that originate in the post-war period, some that originate even earlier, that, for instance, make a German exit, despite George Soros's forceful articulation of why a German exit might make sense, makes it not actually possible in political terms. But again, these path dependencies limit possibilities, but they do not determine the outcome. And it also leaves open an opportunity to talk about different time horizons. And I would draw your attention to Schumpeter's article about the coming depression and depressive tendencies in the 1920s. This also actually links up very, very nicely with what Bruce Greenwald was talking about over lunch. But again, the question is providing an ability to think about different time horizons. Relevant historical comparisons vary, but in terms of the conference we did on the political economy of the Eurozone crisis, we were thinking on the one hand about the fiscal union of the crown in 1707 in Great Britain and the consequences that had for the credible commitment thesis. We also talked about the Latin monetary union, about Germany and the United States in the 1860s, and then later about the gold standard. So, so in terms of the diachronic approach, this does respect these, although it's not possible to integrate them into a formal model. In terms of financial architectures, structural analysis allows you to think about internally structured systems and relations and proportions between different markets. Within the global financial system, subsystem systems are relatively independent, others are more integrated. We had speakers illustrate that. The Eurozone crisis should be understood on the basis of the Eurozone's integration with other systems, globally and internally. In terms of political economy, the idea is to identify different possible political domains and to ask the question, for example, is the Eurozone a political domain? The internal structure of economic domains, industrial interdependencies and stages of production, multi-level interaction between economic and political domains, how are economic sectors and political groups related? In terms of structural governance, the idea is to avoid single recipes, which do not take into account structures, mechanisms, and workings, and instead to think about grounded virtuality, which is, again, heavily indebted to Herbert Simon, but to identify the possibilities afforded by current structural situation, and to specify processes that permit systems to reach them. So that's a kind of overview, and I think actually the problem I have is that I can't actually project my voice enough to go back and illustrate this in any more detail. So I think that's actually about the best I can do now. What I will say, however, is that this is a joint research project in the Center for Financial History in Cambridge, and my co-authors, Roberto Scazieri, who is a professor of economics and economic analysis at the University of Bologna, and Ivano Cardinali, who's a young social theorist at Emmanuel College, is a Mead Fellow and Research Fellow in Economics, that this is a three-part team, and I, like the first speaker, wanted to acknowledge the co-authors. I'll try to answer any questions, but bear in mind that it may be very, very difficult for me to project my voice enough to do so, but thank you. That was much worse than I thought it was going to be.
A few years ago, I got on a plane to go give a talk at UCLA and USC. I got on the plane, I could talk fine. When I got off the plane, I couldn't talk. It's just like the worst thing ever.
All right, it might seem like we've got three fairly unrelated papers, and that's the way it appeared to me when I saw the titles. But there are actually some links. I just wanted to start with this quote from Bill Gross. I assume everyone knows he heads PIMCO. And in summer 2011, you know, we're looking at the U.S. and okay, we got sort of a recovery from the crisis, but we still have very high measured unemployment and unmeasured officially unemployment, about 25 million people who want a full-time job and can't get one. And so he said, you know, it brings to mind the work of Hyman Minsky. And I'm going to be focusing here on a Minskian approach to solving the unemployment problem. And Bill Gross did point out the main component of Minsky's policy, which was employer of last resort. So I just want to start with this quote. He said, you know, I'd have a shovel in everybody's hand. That's how we're going to solve this unemployment problem. There's just one mistake he made. He said Minsky would use employer of last resort in a crisis. No, this is a permanent policy, a permanent program that will always be in place. I'll explain why. So I'm going to try to make 3 points. Each one of these would require a 40-minute presentation and its own separate paper. And fortunately, we have the papers available to make the argument for every one of these points. So at best, all I can do is introduce the idea to you and then send you to the Levy Economics Institute, and the website will be at the end, where you can find actually more than one paper, several papers on each one of these topics. So first, Minsky argued in the 1960s that a true war on poverty must include a commitment to full employment. Okay, you can't really solve the poverty problem without full employment, continuous full employment. Second, responsibility for full employment must fall to the state. It's not the job of business to ensure that workers are fully employed. Their job, of course, is to make profit. They only employ where it is profitable. And finally, the state, as the sovereign currency issuer, has the financial capacity to meet that responsibility. So the state that issues its own currency can always afford full employment financially. There could be management barriers or issues to deal with. There could be exchange rate issues to deal with. There could be inflation issues to deal with. Okay, management of the program, political problems, but you can financially afford it. Okay, so these are the 3 points that I'll be trying to make. Now, I assume that I don't recognize most people here, so I don't know how much of what I'm going to say is just completely something new. You've never heard any of this before, but you probably have heard the name Hyman Minsky because of the crisis. Okay, so his name is very well known now, and he's associated with financial instability and financial crises and so on. So it probably is news to you, almost all of you, that he wrote almost as much on poverty, unemployment, inequality, and income distribution. That work is not very well known, even by the closest Minsky followers. They never read this stuff, okay? When he was at University of California at Berkeley, he spent as much time on this as he did on financial instability, and he developed it at the same time. His approach to solving the unemployment problem really was part of his approach to solving the instability problem. The two are very well connected in his theory. I won't have time to make that link, okay? I'm not going to talk about financial instability at all. So anyway, a lot of writings on this stuff. The reason why Berkeley and Minsky were interested in this is because of the proposal for a war on poverty. The idea started with President Kennedy. He got assassinated. Johnson took over, and Johnson is the one who implemented the war on poverty. I'm not going to go through everything on every slide, but just very quickly, in spite of what everyone says, we had the era of Keynesianism. The approach actually taken in the United States was supply side, tax cuts. Tax cuts were going to stimulate the economy and spur investment. Okay, the war on poverty was going to rehabilitate the poor, so this is the educational approach. The problem with the poor is, well, we had a culture of poverty thesis of Moynihan. They have behavioral problems and attitude problems, but also they have a lack of skill in education, so we're going to solve that problem with the war on poverty. And then finally, we have some other New Deal style programs, Medicare, Medicaid, food stamps, welfare spending that will take up the gap that's not solved by educating the poor. By the late 1970s, the political balance had shifted against that, so the war on poverty period was very short. The liberal approach to resolving the problem of poverty, and in fact there was a reaction against it and said, actually all the things you're doing is creating poverty because you're reducing the incentive for people to work. Then we had Reagan, who argued that people were poor by choice, okay? And finally, we had President Clinton, who said we're going to end welfare as we know it, and we completely got rid of any entitlement to welfare in the United States. You have 5 years, lifetime, and then you're off forever, okay? There's no responsibility to take care of the poor. They have to find jobs. This was Bill Clinton's approach. Stephanie Kelton, who's back there, and I wrote a couple of papers, which you can find the main one at Levy, on the war on poverty, examining the question, did the war on poverty actually reduce poverty rates? And I'll just give you the conclusion very quickly. The answer is no, it did not reduce poverty rates. Now, poverty rates in the US did go down, but it was concentrated among the elderly. And the reason why poverty rates went down for the elderly is very clear. It was Social Security. So actually, the war on poverty, even during the period where it was implemented before it was dismantled by Reagan and then Clinton, it did not reduce poverty rates. Okay? Quick answer. Poverty not only remains a serious problem, it has actually increased, okay, in part as a result of the reaction against welfare, but more importantly, because of rising long-term unemployment and falling labor force participation rates, especially for lowly educated men. So the poverty problem remains with us and actually has increased. In the 60s, when Minsky was studying the approaches to take to solving the poverty problem, he argued the war on poverty is going to fail if it doesn't have a direct job creation component. He corresponded with Sergeant Shriver. The older people here will remember that he was in charge of the war on poverty. So I've seen the correspondence back and forth. Minsky was arguing you have to have direct job creation or you're not going to reduce poverty rates. And although Shriver and probably some others did agree with Minsky on this, Johnson was absolutely opposed to it. He didn't want the government to get involved in creating jobs for the unemployed, and he was much more influenced by the Council of Economic Advisors, who took a typical Keynesian economic approach to the poverty problem. They thought poverty is not inextricably linked to unemployment, that unemployment could be sufficiently reduced through aggregate demand policies such as reducing taxes, and that in any case you need unemployment to serve as a buffer stock in order to prevent inflationary pressures. This was the early implementation in policy terms of the Phillips curve trade-off notion. So we actually don't want to solve the unemployment problem. We do want to solve the poverty problem, but not by giving them jobs, because we need some people unemployed to keep wage pressures down. So Minsky had argued that the problem really can only be resolved by providing jobs, not by providing transfer payments. And I don't know if you can read that from back where you're sitting. But as a percent of GDP, transfer payments increased from 7 or 8% to 18% of GDP, while poverty's rising, except among seniors. In the early 1970s, Minsky calculated that if you gave one minimum wage job, full-time, per poor family, you would eliminate 2/3 of poverty. And he also showed that the extra GDP created by providing that one minimum wage job per family would much more than pay for, in terms of real goods and services being produced, the extra consumption of the poor families as they rise out of poverty. So it would more than pay for itself in aggregate terms. Stephanie and I calculated, and you can read in the paper, I think around 2000, we did the same calculation. The story remained true. And that is, with a minimum wage in the US, which I'm sure you all know is far below a living wage, it's extremely low pay, it has not kept pace with inflation, so it's lower now than when Minsky made his calculation, it still eliminates 2/3 of poverty. Okay? So it would be a tremendous boost to poor families if you could give them one full-time job. Now, we're not advocating keeping minimum wages really low. I'm just saying, as a pure mathematical exercise, it goes a long way towards solving the poverty problem, as Minsky had argued back in the 70s. I don't have time to go through this in detail, but we can think of short-run causes of unemployment. The business cycle. Right now, we're living in the aftermath of the financial crisis, so it's not surprising that we have a lot of unemployment. But there also are long-run causes of unemployment that have tended to cause unemployment to rise over time, not just in the developed countries, but around the world. In 2007, before the financial crisis hit, the ILO came out with a report, said that global unemployment was at an all-time high. All-time high. This was at a business cycle peak. Okay? This was in the era of the Great Moderation. Global unemployment was at an all-time high. And it was largely structural. Okay? That was the conclusion of the ILO's report. So we have problems of demand gaps that are structural. Well, Bruce was talking about this too. Okay, we have chronically too low aggregate demand, even at business cycle peaks, to create enough jobs. We have structural unemployment and jobless growth. Again, Bruce is talking about that. Capital is too productive, so we can't create enough jobs even when investment is rising. So the jobs program is not needed just for the crisis, the short-term unemployment problem. It's also needed for the long-term unemployment problem. We need to create jobs that don't rely on the private sector responding to aggregate demand, because even as aggregate demand grows, jobs don't grow nearly as fast. Typically, they grow about half as fast as aggregate demand grows. So you can't solve the problem simply by raising aggregate demand. I don't think I need to go through in detail. The costs of unemployment, of course, there are individual costs. There are huge social costs to unemployment. There is my claim, and Matt Forstater, one of my colleagues at UMKC, made it first. You can't think of any other economic problem that causes as large social costs as unemployment. Okay, and just today, somebody sent me this graph that shows the correlation between unemployment and suicide in Japan. Now, of course, suicide varies greatly depending on culture, so we're not going to find such a perfect match everywhere, but this is clearly a tremendous cost of unemployment. The benefits of full employment, again, go way beyond the benefits to the individual. They get family income, because as we know, you can provide family income through welfare, again, depending on your culture. In the United States, very hard to do this. Other countries are more socially cohesive. It's more possible to solve it, but you still don't provide all the other benefits that employment provides that go way beyond providing sufficient income. Now, the third point. Even if I can convince at least progressives and liberals that we ought to solve the unemployment problem, that full employment ought to be a goal, many people will even disagree with that. But even when I get people to agree, they say, well, but the problem is, how can we possibly afford this? And when I first heard Minsky talk about employer of last resort, that also was my thought. Well, it sounds great, but how is the government going to be able to afford to provide jobs to 25 million people right now in the US today? How can we afford it? So we have President Obama saying, we're already out of money. Okay, 25 million unemployed, it's too bad, but the government is already broke. So the third piece, the case that has to be made is that a sovereign government that issues its own currency can always financially afford to buy anything that's for sale in its own currency. By definition, someone who's unemployed who wants to work for dollars, Canadian, by definition, the government can employ them because the government is the issuer of Canadian dollars. Okay. Any sovereign government that issues its own currency can afford to employ its unemployed. We still have to solve the problem of what are they going to do? How will we manage the program? So there's lots of questions that still remain once we recognize they can afford to hire them, okay? There's the exchange rate regime puts an additional constraint on government, so it's not affordability, but you might worry about being able to continue to manage your exchange rate. So floating the exchange rate gives you more policy space, makes it more possible to spend without worrying about the exchange rate. I'm going to have to skip this whole modern money paradigm, modern money theory, which we've written tons on, available at the Levy Institute and also at a blog site that I'll give the link to at the end. I just don't have time to go through explaining why it is that sovereign governments that issue their own currency don't face financial constraints. They face self-imposed constraints. They have to budget the spending. There's politics involved. Operational constraints that they impose on themselves. Okay, all those things I can do in question and answer if you want. But the only constraint they actually face is a full employment constraint, okay? As long as there are people who want to work, the government can employ them. Okay, finally, I just want to say a little bit about how Minsky envisioned the employer of last resort program to function in the economy. We've gradually over time moved to calling it the job guarantee rather than employer of last resort, which is what Minsky used. And mainly this is marketing. It doesn't sound too good to say last resort. Who wants to work in a program where it's the last resort? Okay, so and job guarantee really captures what we're trying to say. There is a guarantee that if you're ready and willing to work, you can get a job in this program. Okay, so that is the guarantee. You have to be willing to work. Okay, it's an alternative to the notion of a Phillips curve trade-off, that is keeping a buffer stock of unemployed. This is a buffer stock of employed. They're employed in jobs that are created by the government, not necessarily managed by the government, but the wages are paid for by the national government. They are available to be hired at any markup above the program wage. So they still act as a buffer stock, actually as a better buffer stock than the unemployed do, because they actually are going to work. Okay? They're demonstrating their willingness to work and their ability to work, so that they can be hired into the private sector whenever it wants to employ labor. Let's see. It's the program wage becomes the minimum wage. So when I say here that you get a job at the minimum wage, we're not necessarily talking about the current minimum wage. What we're saying is that the wage in this program by definition will be the minimum wage, because no private employer can retain their labor force unless they offer a wage at least equal to this one. So it effectively becomes the minimum wage in the society. So you maintain continuous full employment, defined as there is a job available at the program wage for anybody who wants to work. Okay, so through the thick and thin of the business cycle, you always have full employment. It's not going to eliminate the business cycle, but it is going to help stabilize the economy. And the reason is because when the private sector downsizes and people lose their private sector job, they go into this program. So it establishes a floor to how low incomes can go to the wage in this program. So it actually helps to promote consumption stability, price stability, wage stability, and our argument is exchange rate stability too, because it helps to stabilize the economy, which helps to stabilize the exchange rate. Okay, I already talked about this. I think I'm out of time, so I'm going to skip this. In the beginning, we were focusing on developed countries. In the last couple of years, we've started developing this kind of a program for developing countries that face different kinds of issues than developed countries. And so it is able, you are able to formulate this sort of a program in developing countries that issue their own currency. Now, the final thing I'll say is that you really have to modify the proposal when you're talking about countries that don't issue their own currency, countries that adopt currency board arrangements, and finally, European nations that join the EMU. They are not sovereign in the currency sense, and they may not be able to offer this open-ended job guarantee program. So they might have to implement limited job guarantee programs consistent with their ability to finance them, because they're not currency sovereign nations anymore. Anyway, my favorite quote from Keynes: the idea you need to keep 1/10 of your population in enforced idleness, he says, is crazy. Okay, this is a crazy idea. And 10%, of course, would be an improvement over the situation in most countries, even developed countries, where we operate our economy typically with about 15 to 17% of the population in enforced idleness in the best of times in the United States. Okay? And if you go to, say, Mexico, it's 50% of the population in enforced idleness. Keynes says, this is crazy. Okay? So finally, here are the websites. There's Levy, where you can find the academic papers, and blogs where we write more on the policy issues. Thanks.
So I guess we'll take questions. Is there no moderator, I guess?
Chair.
Chair?
You're the chair.
I'm the chair? All right, I'll be the chair. Any more questions? Comments? Sure.
In regards to that, could you elaborate a little bit why the program would favor price stability?
Yeah.
Should we do one or at a time?
Yeah,
or
let's do one
take
at a time.
several?
Why don't we do one at a time? Because it might just jump around too much.
Okay, well, I think it's fairly clear that it stabilizes wages on the downside, right? Everyone will accept that because wages cannot fall below the program wage, so that helps to stabilize wages on the downside, helps to stabilize consumption on the downside, so it helps to stabilize prices on the downside. So I think there's no quibble on that one. The question is on the upside. Okay, well, let's think about an economic boom where the private sector is trying to expand employment. Our argument is this program is offering workers who are showing up to work every day, demonstrating that they're employable, and I didn't say this, but in Minsky's proposal, the goal is that every job in the program is providing on-the-job training, improving the human capital of the workers in the program in comparison to the unemployed, who clearly are losing human capital, not gaining it. So the idea is that the private sector in a boom is able to recruit a much better workforce out of this program in order to expand their own production without going out and trying to bid up wages of the employed in the private sector or raising their costs by hiring workers from the pool of unemployed who with questionable skills, attitude, commitment to work, and all of that. So it also helps on the upside in preventing wage and price spiral by providing a pool of employable labor. And finally, as the labor is drawn out of the employer of last resort or job guarantee pool, government spending is automatically going down. So the government's budget is going to move strongly counter-cyclical automatically. In a slump, government spending automatically goes up. The budget deficit increases because the pool gets bigger. In an expansion, the pool shrinks because the workers are being hired out into the private sector, so the budget deficit automatically shrinks. So government spending is counter-cyclical too, and that helps to remove excess demand from the economy in a boom, so it helps to stabilize prices in the upswing too. So those are the arguments. There are additional ones that are more technical. It has to do with Minsky's views on the cause of inflation in a developed capitalist economy where you have a segment of the labor force and a segment of private firms where you have strong oligopoly power. And usually economic growth means you're stimulating those sectors of the economy. They tend to be highly inflation prone. So rather than that approach to try to solve the unemployment problem, you solve the unemployment problem with employer of last resort, you will have a much less inflationary environment. Okay, so the best place to get to that is Minsky's 1968 article, but I can give you a citation later.
Other questions?
Thanks for the thought-provoking last speech. If I can jump in there. Having the privilege of being Dutch, we've seen this program in action. Dismal failure. Dismal. We got the job training, the government did pretty much whatever you told them to. And the people stayed in the program, did not transfer, only 20%, 15% actually transferred out. They transferred out to miserable jobs where they didn't keep it. They fell back into unemployment. The program was then transmuted towards a more German-style training on the job. The jobs that the government provided in the original scheme were not very technical, high-skilled jobs. It turns out that the German system of on-the-job training, of getting them, getting this reservoir hired at subsidized prices inside the actual industry, has much better retainment results than the government-induced program. Can I invite you to move to dance a little bit with that example?
Yeah.
Thanks.
Okay, first, I don't know anything about the Netherlands. I do know of programs that were developed more or less close to the model that I'm talking about, where the results are much better than what you're talking about. But first, we need to make some things clear. Remember, in Minsky's proposal, this is a permanent program. It would not be considered to be a failure if there were individuals who worked their whole career in this program. That, by itself, that's not a failure, okay? These people are doing productive things. They're not producing profit, but the goal is to produce things that are socially valuable and recognized to be valuable by the population that is not in this program. So Minsky said, you know, we need to make sure for two reasons that people in this program are not digging holes and burying them. One, nobody wants that kind of a job, okay? It's bad for the workers. They want to feel productive. And I can tell you, I interviewed about 100 workers in Argentina in the Jefes program, which was similar to this, where when you asked workers, what is the thing you like most about working in the Jefes program, you would have thought they would say my income, because these were very poor people, okay, who had been unemployed. Many of these people had never had a regular wage job. That never came in the top 5. Number 1 always was, I feel useful. I'm contributing to my neighbors. That always was number 1. So that's very important. The other thing is, in a developed country, a rich nation, Canada, the US, most people probably won't work in this program. Even throughout their whole lives, they probably will never be in this program. They have to believe they get a benefit too. They have to see the benefits of the program, okay? The American New Deal jobs programs, we all saw the benefits. Now, we're 3 or 4 generations away from that, and so we hear neoconservatives say that all they did was dig holes. You know, it's an absolute lie, okay? And the people in the 30s and 40s knew that was a lie. They saw the products, okay? The public buildings all over the United States were built by the workers in this program. Now, it may not be public buildings that we need, but we have to see useful output coming from the program, okay? So those are absolutely essential. Now, the goal is that you want the workers to serve as a buffer stock, to go into the private sector when they're needed and to go out. But there will be many individuals that the private sector doesn't want to hire out of the program, okay? It could be just plain old discrimination. We don't like that race. We don't like that gender. Or it could be their educational status, okay? Or it could be actually they don't have the skills for the high-skilled jobs. The workers in this program are not going to be sufficient for their needs, okay? So that can happen. But you do want at least some of these people to be moving in and out of the program to fulfill the private sector's demand. The German example, I'm a little skeptical that that's not just a very, very special case where the setup of the euro was, I think, by design, but it maybe by accident was set up to favor Germany. and it has favored Germany, and Germany has a labor shortage, and it's not too surprising that firms actually do create new jobs when you subsidize, and if you can get a worker in there, they will keep the worker. So I'm not too surprised that it's working in Germany now. I'm very skeptical that it's going to work generally. The United States experience with subsidizing wages to get firms to hire workers that they don't really want is a complete failure, always a failure. If they find someone they really want, they fire someone else. So it never net created jobs, and most of the time they don't keep the people once the subsidy is gone. So the U.S. experience is completely different from that. And I think that's probably the more general experience. I think Germany's very specific.
I've got a lot of sympathy with your proposal. The only the question that kept coming back to my mind is that compatible with globalization? Probably not. You need to have some protection, which relates also to the comments that today Bruce was making. That I mean, this whatever measure taken on the employment side is essentially offering most likely non-tradable services. But then there is an issue of balance of payment. And I think in any case, I mean, full employment measure aimed at creating full employment are incompatible with the current system of trade in which all manufacturing is moving to China. I mean, not all manufacturing, but a good deal of manufacturing. So I'd say this has got to be associated with protection, at least in broad areas, say the European Union, the United States. Do you agree?
Okay. I'm not necessarily against protection. I think this is case by case. I don't think it's a good idea for developed capitalist countries, rich capitalist countries, to protect against developing countries. So in those cases, I probably wouldn't support it. For developing nations that implement an employer of last resort, actually I do agree with you, and this is part of the change we make when we talk about a developing nation that implements this. If they don't plan it well, you're right, they're probably going to increase their imports, and they're going to have balance of payments problems. And so you want to probably have some protectionism, you probably want to have capital controls, but you also want to develop the program itself in a way to provide domestically produced goods and services, okay, so that at least some of the demand goes to the domestic sector instead of to imports. You want to perhaps have a development strategy to enhance your ability to export so that even though imports come in, exports are going out. You know, tourism is an obvious one for some countries. You want to develop your tourism so you have the export of tourism services. So you can try to solve those problems that way. I agree with Bruce, forget manufacturing in the developed countries. It's gone. Forget it. We need a replacement for it. I agree with him. It's going to be mostly the service sector, construction also, infrastructure, those things that are domestically, for the most part, produced. That's the future. This program supplements that. Okay? As you said, these are mostly going to be services, elder services, young services. These things, there is no danger of foreign competition to them because you're taking care of the elderly here. Well, I'm less concerned about balance of payment issues for sovereign countries that float their currencies. But obviously this is a huge thing. We can't do it in 3 minutes. Oh, since nobody's, I had a question for you on yours. Can I do that?
Me?
Yeah.
Sure.
Did you plug in for the U.S. race?
Yeah.
And?
Oh, but if you, what do you want to, do you
Well,
want to
at
know?
the very, at the
If you
very
look,
low
if
end.
you look within race, if you look only at whites or only at blacks, or only, I think you can break up Hispanics too, because they oversample Hispanics in the U.S. as well. You see very similar patterns of income and attendance within any race as well. These results aren't driven by race.
Well, the difference between Canada and the U.S., how much would race?
Well, if you, I mean, you could, so we did some analysis where you can focus on whites. If you look at whites in the U.S., I don't remember what we all looked at, but whites in the U.S., and in Canada you focused on English-speaking white Canadians, non-immigrant. You focus on non-immigrants in both countries, you get exactly the same thing. It's really quite stable across the board. Go ahead.
Same question. I'm thinking, does it make a difference if you include the total expense of going to school, like not just tuition? So, and then if you look at the low income, I am a foreign student too, but in my discussion classes, I noticed that most may come in through sports programs and other things. So is it possible that even within the low-income groups who are in, how many come through just similar criteria like higher income groups? So if you take in the total cost and not just tuition, is it going to change the income dynamics?
Well,
Plus, who gets in?
What other costs are you thinking?
Like, maybe I didn't get your presentation right, but it looks like you were looking at tuition. And I'm thinking about living expenses and other things your parents may chip into.
Well, living expenses in Canada and the U.S. are actually quite similar. There's going to be, I mean, there's a lot of variance across states and big cities versus small cities. Very similar in Canada. That would be similar in Canada. One thing that is quite a bit different in the U.S. and Canada is in Canada, students are much more likely to stay at home, go to school locally than they are in the U.S. But that's in the end, they take a lot of aid away in those cases. So if you're among the lower income students, it's not clear you're much better off by doing that. Actually, in the U.S., surprisingly, although all of the rules suggest aid should be taken away if you live at home, it doesn't appear as though much is. So I showed only results for students that are living away away from home, which is the majority. I think 35% live at home in Canada and 20% in the U.S. But if you sort of do the same types of graphs for students living at home, you'll see the same types of patterns.
Okay, and then I've got a question.
Question. Well, let's let this lady, she's raised her hand a few times.
Sorry, thank you. Same sort of questions. One is, this was a cross-section at a point in time?
This?
Yeah.
Effectively, yeah. It's they're cohorts. Well, they're cohort samples. They sampled them, but it is sort of basically a cohort of students.
Yeah, that went through the system at one time. So my question is, because I'm not going to give up all the economic arguments here.
Oh, I'm not suggesting we do.
No, I know. I'm just giving you a hard time. Is the opportunity cost of going to school in terms of foregone income in occupations that don't require post-secondary? So I'm from British Columbia. You didn't need to go to university or college to get a really good, high-paying job in the resource sector 20 years ago. You know, and a lot of kids, if you look at our participation rates in PS, post-secondary, they were quite a bit below, say, Ontario, where, you know, you had to have more education to get into those jobs. That's gone now. So, you know, they're the forest, that we don't have a forest industry anymore because of climate change. It's another story. But, so I wonder if you look at that. And the other side is the supply side. And so these were people going to school in the 80s.
Well, the early 2000s.
Early 2000s. So, I mean, so that wouldn't accommodate that. But I wonder if you went back, you know, when we had a huge increase in the number of spots in post-secondary education. So I wonder if you control for the supply side at all, the availability of spots, relatively speaking, and may not be different, but we had a big ramping up, and then we also had a ramping up of we turned colleges into universities, and that was really recent, both in Ontario and BC. So those are, I mean, I'm just trying to throw out a few more factors. And I'm not sure I buy your ethnicity argument, because I think there are significant differences in ethnicity across Canada and the US in terms of,
I agree with that.
Of attitude towards PSE. Again, I'm from British Columbia. The ethnic groups that we have are very highly represented in post-secondary education because of the cultural component of it. And again, ties in. There's a lot of endogeneity is my point. Question on the last speaker. How have we gotten so far away from the notion that the private sector could only create jobs, or putting it another way, why did the Tea Party, why do they get to rule?
Okay, so let me try and answer. Let me throw one thing out there that I didn't talk about, but that I think makes me concerned about some of these stories about tastes and whether low-income families don't value education the way high-income families do in the U.S. and somehow not in Canada. And that is, if you go back and look at students that went in the early 1980s, so there's this very similar survey to what we used. This is the NLSY 97. There's an NLSY 79, which is a cohort of kids that went to the university and college in the early 80s in the U.S. And there, once you condition on math and reading ability, there's very little income. The differences in attendance by income are very similar to what they look like in Canada now. So I kind of didn't have time to get into this, but there's and this is sort of the subject of a previous paper, which is, it's quite surprising how dramatic the change has been in the U.S. in terms of how much more important income is now all of a sudden relative to 20 years ago. So I think the challenge to a story that is based on sort of preferences or cultural sort of attitudes is, how did that change in basically a generation? And I'm actually somewhat skeptical that that's the right explanation, but I think as an economist, I don't have the first idea how to really think about how people are forming these preferences and how they might change, et cetera. I mean, this is one thing, I guess I'm a mainstream economist in the sense that I'm not used to thinking about that issue, whereas I think some other social sciences might be helpful. As far as the cultural, the ethnicity issue, I mean, we see it within any ethnic group, within whites only, it's actually quite robust, this relationship in Canada or the U.S. We did do some things to try and deal with whether the unemployment, whether sort of the opportunity costs are very different. I don't think between Canada and the U.S. they're dramatically different. The wages for high school graduates I don't think are dramatically different. But one thing we try to do is basically look across different areas that would have either high unemployment rates or relatively low unemployment rates, in some sense thinking that might be a proxy for what opportunity costs might be. If you're living in a city where unemployment rates are extremely high, maybe there's not a lot of good jobs for you if you're a high school graduate. On the other hand, if unemployment rates are quite low, and there again, within high unemployment areas or within low unemployment areas, we see the same pattern that family income is quite important in the U.S. I don't know if we looked at that in Canada, but that was true in the U.S. anyway.
Just to jump in on this discussion of post-secondary education, I've heard it said in the U.S. that if you condition for family income, that the most important determinant is level of maternal education. And I'm wondering if you have any way of looking at that for this cohort.
Yeah, so we did control for maternal education in these. You can control for father's education as well, and that does play a role. It's important, but even conditioning on that, you'll see that the family income is quite important as well. So all these things are important. I mean, it's important to not lose sight of the fact that income is not the most important thing in these. This achievement of how good you are at math and reading when you're a teenager is by far the most important factor. I mean, it's 30, 40, 50 percentage point differences in attendance between high test scores and lows. And that's as it should be, I would think. What's a bit more, so that's not surprising in any way. I guess what's a bit disturbing is that we don't think income should be particularly important. And it appears to have become more important in the U.S., and it's somewhat interesting that it's not very important in Canada. Whether Canada's just 20 years behind the U.S. on this one, I don't know.
I'll just be real quick. I think that we're probably out of time. Let me just refer you to Bill Mitchell has a great book, and the whole thing is about why did we lose the commitment to full employment. And a lot of it has to do with this notion of the Phillips curve trade-off. I've studied the U.S. Fed. We have the transcripts. We know exactly what they discuss when they're deciding whether to raise interest rates or not. And they get very worried when the unemployment rate goes down. And so they raise rates. Now, I don't believe raising rates has that much impact. I'm with Bruce on that. But I'm just telling you, this is the attitude. We need to keep a very large pool of unemployed. And the problem is you lose human capital when you have long-term unemployed, and they know this. The long-term unemployed no longer serve any useful purpose except that they go to prison, and then they serve as a useful example to what can happen to you if you get out of line. But you need an even bigger pool of unemployed because so many of the unemployed are no longer useful for that. And that's why we've done it.
Thank you. We should probably end there, given we're over time. Thanks.